Now, this little lesson is going to be on the idea of presuppositional apologetics, but I don't want to teach it in the typical way I've gone about it. I don't want to go through and discuss Van Til and Bonce and all these guys in depth. I instead want to go through some of the work Iain McGilchrist has done on the topic and kind of analyze some of his comments in his book, The Master and His Emissary. So what I hope to do in this short lesson is give you guys a little bit of an introduction to what presuppositional apologetics are and how that affects your thinking and your belief system and your point of view. And then I want to go to Iain McGilchrist and kind of look at the left and right hemispheres of the brain and brain science and how he talks about how we should prove theories and ideas. So that's going to be the focus. I'm only going to spend a little bit of time explaining presuppositionalism, but we're mostly going to be working with Iain McGilchrist's work here in this one. So first, let's start with the idea of apologetics, okay? What apologetics has been traditionally defined as is a defense of the faith, okay? So you have Christian beliefs and you need to defend them, right? Why do you believe what you believe? And the word that is used to describe this comes from the Greek in 1 Peter 3:15. It says this, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." So this word right here, make a defense, in Greek is right here, apologia, or apology, or where we get the phrase apologetics from. So it's to make a defense for the faith. That's what apologetics is. Now, in apologetics, there are traditionally two positions, okay? The first approach is the most popular one. That is to reason from first principles to the idea of God using traditional argumentation, okay? So this is often where you'll find discussions like proofs for the existence of God, cosmological argument, teleological argument, etc. Okay, that is all sometimes referred to as evidentialist apologetics, to provide evidence for what you believe. Okay, that is one approach, and it's a traditional approach, a more philosophical approach in many ways, shapes, and forms. Okay, and very, very popular to use that form of apologetics. Now, a guy came around named Cornelius Van Til. And Cornelius Van Til came up with a completely different approach to apologetics, okay? He essentially said this, wait a second, guys. We don't have all the same first principles, right? You can't just appeal to, hey, we all believe this, of course. Now let me reason to God from here. Van Til said, no, we have different first principles. We have different foundations that we're arguing from. We have different presuppositions. And so he came up with an approach to apologetics called presuppositional apologetics, okay? And then this was furthered by a lot of his students. So here's Greg Bahnsen, for example. Presuppositional apologetics, stated and defended by Greg Bahnsen. That's where I learned presuppositional apologetics from. But you also have other authors like John Frame, right? If you look at Frame, for example, John Frame has a complete approach to apologetics, right? Now, there are more positions than presuppositionalism and evidentialism when it comes to apologetics. Here you have, look, 5 approaches. Classical apologetics, William Lane Craig. Evidential, Gary Habermas. Cumulative case, Paul Feinberg. Presuppositional, John Frame. And reformed epistemology, Kelly James Clark. But for the sake of my argument, I'm kind of combining these last 2 and these first 2. Okay, these are more evidential or classical. These are more presuppositional or reformed. And then cumulative case is really the happy medium. Cumulative case kind of just says, I use whatever works, right? So that's the idea. Now, why this approach? Why this shift? Why did people go to this idea where we want to recognize presuppositional apologetics? Well, the reason is because we don't all assume the same things when it comes to the world. So, oftentimes, we need to recognize that we have different fundamental underlying worldviews with which we look at the world. Now, what's a worldview? Well, the way that Greg Bahnsen talked about it, and I'm just going to bring up a quick document here. The way that Greg Bahnsen talked about it is that a worldview is made up of three interconnected pieces. And these three interconnected pieces for Bahnsen were reality, epistemology, and morality. Okay, so let's just put these out here. What sorts of things exist? Reality. How do we know those things exist? Epistemology. And how should we live our lives? Morality. Okay? You kind of assume these things to begin with. So let me just give an example. A typical worldview is called materialism. And I don't mean this like you like to buy things, okay? Sometimes this is referred to as naturalistic materialism. This worldview states that the only things that exist are the things that we can perceive with our senses. So you can taste it, touch it, smell it, something like that, okay? So what is naturalistic materialism? Well, naturalistic materialism views that the things that are real, what sorts of things exist? Well, physical things, right? Physical things exist. It assumes at the outset, for example, a great skepticism when it comes to things like ghosts, when it comes to things that are immaterial in nature, okay? Why? Because naturalistic materialism assumes that physical things are the only things that exist. That's the nature of reality. Epistemology. How can we discern that these things exist? Well, we can do that through what's called empiricism. Empiricism is science, right? Empiricism is measuring it, weighing it, okay? Dealing with it in an experimental fashion, okay? An empirical way. So, things exist that are physical and they are discovered empirically, okay? Finally, how should we live our lives? Morality. Now, there are several different approaches to morality from naturalistic materialistic perspective. Not very often does a naturalistic materialist appeal to, for example, God or anything like that when it comes to morality, because they don't believe he exists. So instead, they'll often appeal to things like the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Okay? So, we should try to get the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That is trying to refer to, okay, it's a physical thing. We can all see what happiness looks like. Let's try to maximize happiness across the board for the human race. And that is a sort of morality that fits with this worldview. But here's what I want you to see, guys. These things all come together, okay? It would be weird to be an empiricist who thinks that there are more than just physical things that exist. Otherwise, you would ask yourself, well, how can I gain that knowledge? And you would do it through rationalism, perhaps, or through divine revelation or whatever. Here's what I want you to see. Worldviews hang together, okay? They have a coherent perspective through which they look at things. This is the naturalistic materialist worldview, just broadly speaking. Let's go down and do the exact same exercise real quick for Christianity. Okay? Christianity believes not only are there physical things, but there are physical things and spiritual things. Well, how can we know those things? Well, the physical things might be deduced through empiricism, but the spiritual things can't be deduced through empiricism. So you need empiricism plus divine revelation. Okay? This is sometimes in theology referred to as natural revelation and special revelation. Okay? Sometimes referred to in these terms. So that's their view of epistemology. Finally, morality isn't greatest happiness for the greatest number, but morality is something like we live how God's character requires us to live. Okay? So do you see how all of this hangs together? This is one worldview, Christianity. This is another worldview. They perceive things as a cohesive whole with certain parts and implications that all hang together. The way that Greg Bahnsen described it is this. He said, your worldview is not like marbles in a jar. Okay. A lot of people treat their worldview like marbles in a jar. I have one belief here about science. I have a belief about reality. I have a belief about morality. And I can pick and choose different pieces and parts. And Greg Bahnsen said, no, your worldview is not like marbles in a jar, distinct and separate beliefs. Instead, your worldview is like a spider web. Okay. In that all of your beliefs and ideas hang together and they tie to other beliefs and ideas that you have, okay? They all hang together and they tie together. This is very important because this is often what contributes to people of differing worldviews or backgrounds talking past each other. What happens? Well, somebody who has a naturalistic materialist approach to the world, okay, they come across a Christian and they say, prove to me that God exists. Okay. Well, what are they expecting to see? Some sort of empirical proof in a physical way in terms of an experiment or something like that. Because their epistemology is, I prove things through science, so you need to prove God exists to me through science. And often the Christian they'll either have an argument or maybe they won't or whatever, but they will inevitably fail to provide empirical proof of God's existence, and the naturalistic materialist will then say, see, therefore God doesn't exist. The same goes for down here. The Christian will assume certain things about the world, say divine revelation, and so oftentimes the Christian will quote a Bible verse to the naturalistic materialist, because in their epistemology, divine revelation or special revelation is how you deduce what spiritual things exist. And so they'll quote that, they'll use that, and the naturalistic the naturalistic materialist will say something like, yeah, but I don't believe in divine revelation. I don't believe God exists. So they talk past each other, okay? This was the insight that was provided essentially by Greg Bahnsen. Greg Bahnsen essentially demonstrated for us that, when it comes to talking to each other about the most important, the most foundational, the most fundamental ideas of reality, we often talk past each other because we have differing presuppositions. And that's why it's called presuppositional apologetics. Marin, couldn't you appeal to the naturalist with the physical archaeological evidence / records of the early church? So you could. This is essentially trying to play ball on their terms, right? Let me find some common ground with the person I'm disagreeing with, and let me try to engage with them on their terms. So some people do that, Marin. So oftentimes you will find people who are of this persuasion, classical apologetics, they'll try to prove that God exists through the proof of the resurrection, for example. And they'll start there and they'll try to do that. But here was the brilliant insight of Van Til. Van Til essentially recognized that these foundational realities make a big difference in how you view the world. And oftentimes, you're not sure which realities somebody is going to give up when you try to convince them with evidence or proof. Let me give an example. Greg Bahnsen tells this illustration quite a bit. Let's say you're a doctor, and a man comes to you, and he's convinced that he's dead, okay? He's convinced that he's dead. And you're like, of course you're not dead. You are sitting here in my office talking to me. He's like, no, this is just the after-death dream state, and you're just a projection of my dead subconscious. And you're like, okay, that didn't work. And then you ask him, what about when I pinch you and you feel pain, right? That pain proves you're alive. And he goes, no, even ghosts and spirits can feel pain as well. And you're like, man, how am I going to get to this guy? Well, you come up with a brilliant strategy, okay? This guy comes to you, he's convinced he's dead, and you have an idea. You sit down with him ahead of time, and you go through all of the medical evidence to prove to him that dead men don't bleed. Okay? So you talk to him, you show him diagrams, you show him how blood flows and the heart works, that when somebody dies, the heart is no longer functioning. Dead men don't bleed. Okay? And you sit there and go through all the evidence with him. And you prove to him that dead men don't bleed. And he sits down and he's like, "You're right, doc. I agree. Yeah, looking at the evidence, it's clear as day that dead men don't bleed. I agree with you, doc." Now you've got him. You reach into your drawer and you take out a pin and you prick him on his hand. And he yelps and reaches back, and a bit of red begins to come out of his skin. Boom. You've got him. You prove to him that dead men don't bleed, and you just made him bleed. What is the obvious conclusion that he has to make? The man looks down at his hand, and he looks up at you, and he goes, "Doc, it's amazing." You start to smile, and he goes, "Dead men do bleed after all." You see what happened? You put him in a situation where he had to face two competing truths that you presented him with. And what you did, you thought he was going to sacrifice his belief that he thought he was dead once you proved that he could bleed. But he didn't. Instead, he sacrificed his newly acquired belief that dead men don't bleed. Instead, he said, "Oh no, evidently dead men do bleed." Why? Because more foundational, more fundamental to his belief system was the idea that he was dead than was the idea that dead men don't bleed. You see what I mean? So oftentimes in conversation with people, you will put people in a logical conundrum and you're not sure which belief they're going to give up. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is this. We were talking about naturalistic materialism, okay? And the idea was, well, what if you try to prove to the naturalistic materialist that God exists through using empirical evidence, okay? Now, don't get me wrong. That might work with some people. It might be a valid strategy. But imagine you go through, say, for example, proving that Jesus rose from the dead. And you think to yourself, "I got him," right? I've proven that Jesus rose from the dead. Now he's going to have to believe in God. Let's say you proved it to him empirically, and he agreed. He's like, "Man, you're right. I agree 100%. Jesus rose from the dead." He might conclude that Christianity is real and that his epistemology needs to include room for spiritual realities as well. Or he might merely conclude this: "Wow, I guess you're right. Sometimes crazy things happen in the world. I guess sometimes people rise from the dead. Man, that's nuts that happened. But to me, that doesn't prove God. It doesn't prove Christianity. It doesn't prove Jesus was divine, etc." You see my point? This was the brilliance of recognizing presuppositionalism. This was the brilliance of Van Til, Bahnsen, and many of the followers thereafter. They realized, hold on a second, people are much more complex in their belief systems, okay? Now, there's a reason I'm doing this lesson. I want you guys to see this. So often, when you get into conversations with people about important things, issues of morality, issues of religion, issues of politics, issues of reality, ghosts, all that type of stuff. So often when you get into conversations with people on subjects like this, the understanding of differing worldviews isn't talked about ahead of time. And so often people end up talking past each other. I see this commonly in atheist versus Christian debates and discussions. The atheist might demand evidence for God. The Christian will present something that to them seems, looks, or sounds like evidence. The atheist will dismiss it as not really being evidence. And round in this circle we go. Okay? Instead, if we recognize that people have differing presuppositions, they have differing perspectives and lenses through which they look at all of the evidence, then we can begin to make progress in the conversation. Then we can begin to make progress in the discussion. Now that I've set now that I've set the framework, okay, I just wanted to make you aware of what presuppositionalism is and all that type of stuff. Now that I've set the framework, I want to bring up for you guys the master and his emissary, Iain McGilchrist. And what I want us to see here is that Iain McGilchrist actually talks about proving his theory of brain science, in his theory of the two hemispheres of the brain, in presuppositional terms. He's not doing Christian apologetics or anything like that. What he's trying to prove is this is how things are proven. This is how we embrace ideas. This is how things are accepted. Okay? And I think this will be very helpful if we work through this, because it'll help you to see, oh, the assumptions or presuppositions I have are coloring the way I look at the evidence out there in the world. So let's go to Iain McGilchrist. I have two sections that I want to walk through and talk about briefly in terms of, brain science and the proofs that he kind of gives for his theory. Again, he's trying to prove his theory of the two hemispheres of the brain. And he essentially talks about how this works. Now, here's what I want us to do. I want us to listen through Iain McGilchrist. Now, remember, he is going to talk about how his theory should be tested. He's putting this theory about two hemispheres of the brain and how they interact differently out there in the world. And he essentially says, hey, this is how we test theories, guys. And I want you to notice how he talks about proving whether or not his theory is true or false. So we're going to walk through this because he recognizes the importance of presuppositions. He's not even talking about a religious idea. He's not talking about apologetics, but he does address the topic of presuppositions here, and I think it's relevant. So let's hear what he has to say. Again, here in about 12 seconds or so, it's going to get relevant.
My editor wisely thought I should put most such excursus into the endnotes, for fear of the listener losing the thread of the argument. I think this was good advice. I've carried on reading and discussing with colleagues for a further 10 years, and nothing I have read leads me to change the substance, or even, except in one or two small points, the detail of what I wrote.
Listen.
New evidence continues to fit with a hypothesis. None of the many pieces of evidence can be by itself conclusive, but their convergence across a variety of aspects of human psychology has become increasingly persuasive. Much of this material is incorporated in my current writing, in which I am providing, at least in certain limited areas, which is all that can be humanly achieved, a more comprehensive review of the literature. Is there value in trying to view hemisphere difference, not just as a mass of unrelated technical details, but as a coherent picture at the level of human meaning? This seems to me the important question. To sustain any coherent vision requires one to make an attempt to span fields of knowledge, and as human knowledge expands exponentially, the task becomes ipso facto more difficult.
What's he saying? He's saying that once you start creating a full worldview, then you're trying to go into different areas of human knowledge, and it gets more and more difficult to put together a full or coherent worldview. For example, I see this very often. Naturalistic materialists will often not be well read or studied in philosophy. Why? Well, there's so much material or information out there, it's so hard to keep up on everything. The classical Renaissance man had a lot less to learn than people do nowadays because our knowledge has expanded so much, and we have, driven down to such technical detail in so many areas of human nature, okay? So that's just the nature of the beast. That's how it goes. But his whole point is, look, I'm trying to create a worldview, a lens through which to look at and view many different areas of the world, and this is one way that I've done it. I've created a hypothesis, and I'm using it as a lens through which to look at the world. This is presuppositional, guys. This is how arguments are made. This is how we go back and forth. This is how we make progress. We come up with a hypothesis. Hey, maybe the left and right hemispheres function a little bit differently. And then we try to examine the evidence to see if it backs our hypothesis. That's how this is done. Again, you don't just glom onto some sort of fact or piece of knowledge and then immediately come to, oh, this proves X. No, you run all the evidence you see through a grid or through a filter that is your worldview, and you try to make things fit into place. That's how the human worldview functions. If you get a piece of evidence and you can't make it fit anywhere, you often deny it. For example, Christians are often told, like not even Christians in general, but let's say a young earth creationist, okay? Young earth creationists often told, hey, carbon dating proves the earth is billions of years old. A Christian grabs that piece of evidence and tries to fit it within their worldview. They can't seem to make it fit, right? Well, carbon dating seems to prove that the earth is billions of years old. Well, what are they going to do? Are they going to throw out their young earth creationism or throw out carbon dating? And so often you have seen young earth creationist Christians throw out carbon dating. They'll attack it. They'll say it's not good science. It doesn't fit, etc. The same thing happens on both sides, okay? So you don't just take evidence and examine it and just, go, oh, this makes perfect sense. You try to fit it within your worldview, and if it doesn't fit, either you adjust your worldview or you attack the evidence. This is how it goes. Everybody does this. Christians, atheists alike. Let's hear what he has to say.
Should we therefore abandon the attempt? Certainly, we must conclude that attempting such a synthesis is something that scientists with respectively constrained vision can from now on never attempt. However, with luck, some will be foolhardy enough to try, since the constrained vision is not, absolutely not, a feature of science, but of the nature of the contemporary science establishment.
Hear that difference? We get into this conversation so often when it comes to, again, atheist versus Christian discussions. Atheists will often say something like, science has proven that the earth came about through the Big Bang, and therefore we have no need for God. He doesn't exist. Okay? There is a difference between science itself and what Iain McGilchrist refers to here as the scientific establishment. Okay? There's science, the facts, the data that we look at and use, the empirical knowledge, okay? And there is the scientific worldview or lens through which we look at the world. Those are different things, but so often they're conflated within certain frameworks. Somebody looks at this and they say, this is scientific, and they immediately assume that it therefore backs up their scientific worldview or theory, but that's not necessarily the case. And his point here is when you look at things with a full-orbed worldview, sometimes you don't come to that narrow-minded perspective. You need to be able to differentiate between the two.
As no less a figure than the great evolutionary biologist and paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson, one of the founders of the so-called modern synthesis of Darwinian evolution with Mendelian genetics, the crowning achievement of 20th century biology, wrote, "Science truly to be such must center not on descriptions and names, but on principles, that is, generalizations, theories, relationships, interconnections, explanations about and among the facts."
So, science isn't pure facts, pure information just to be grabbed or gleaned. But again, a lot of people who have a scientific epistemology, who are empirical in their understanding of how we know what we know, they will assume that they just are believing the facts. They have facts, you have faith. But that's not true. Scientific worldviews look through a lens, and we all have the same facts available to us. The only question is, how are we going to interpret those facts from within our worldview? Again, this is very presuppositional, and McGilchrist here is not trying to advocate for Christianity. He's not trying to advocate for presuppositional apologetics. He's actually going to go into it here in a second, and he begins to compare Darwin and how should we evaluate whether or not Darwin's theory of evolution is true. So he's not trying to prove some young earth creationist presuppositional approach here. He's just trying to understand, hey, this is how theories work. This is how worldviews function, and this is how we end up interacting with these ideas.
Although I'm not aware of having been criticized on these grounds, I should forestall a possible misunderstanding. I could understand someone reasonably enough expressing the view that this is a hypothesis that cannot be falsified. That is, however, not the case. While it cannot be falsified by any one experiment, it can certainly be falsified. Parts of it could be more easily falsified than the whole, but even the whole could be falsified. It might be helpful, simply for the purposes of argument, to contrast here the theories of Freud and those of Darwin.
So, oftentimes you hear things like, well, belief in God is not unfalsifiable, right? You can't falsify it, and so it just boils down to faith, and that's it. You can't prove it. I can't prove against it. It is what it is. We're just stuck. But that's not the case. The way you falsify ideas like that is through oblique means, okay? Listen to what he has to say. He's going to compare Freud and Darwin here, and listen to how he talks about how you would falsify certain hypotheses.
Both had hypotheses that have proved enormously influential on subsequent thought. Neither of their hypotheses can be straightforwardly falsified, but for different reasons. Freud has provided us with a body of concepts and a manner in which they are related that is not falsifiable at all, because no empirical observations could distinguish between his theory and any competing theory. The status of his work, then, is like that of a philosophy in that it provides a more or less convincing account of experience and does not depend on scientific data one way or the other to carry that conviction. You take it or leave it, depending on whether it makes sense of your experience than any competing model, which doesn't mean that it is not valuable. We may find that it reconfigures our knowledge in a way that is richer than the one to which we are accustomed and leads to the explanation of otherwise puzzling observations.
So do you see that? He's talking about philosophy, okay? Freud essentially came up with a philosophy that he says is not falsifiable. Fine. How do you go about embracing or rejecting such a perspective? You do so through oblique means. Here's what he essentially says. Does that theory make sense of my life? Does it make sense of the reality in which I exist? Does it make my world more coherent? That's the real question when it comes to engaging with alternate worldviews. That's the real question when it comes to, should we believe in God, should we not, etc. Does this belief system, worldview as a whole, taken as a full perspective, does this belief system make more sense of how I experience things in the world? That's the real question. It's not so much about whether or not this individual thing can be proven or that individual thing is true or false. It is instead, does the whole system make sense of my life? That's the question we need to be asking, and that is often overlooked in these conversations and discussions.
Darwin, by contrast, has provided us with a hypothesis that relates intimately to observations in relation to which empirical data are indeed relevant, notwithstanding the fact that no single experiment can possibly prove or disprove his hypothesis. To quote the Darwinian George Gaylord Simpson again, the most striking example of a theory that cannot be definitively proved or disproved is the most important of all biological theories, that of organic evolution. Although some limited predictions can be deduced from the theory was not in fact established by prediction and is not sufficiently tested by it. An enormous number of observations, enormously varied in kind, are all consistent with this theory, and many of them are consistent with no other theory that has been proposed.
So do you hear that? Here, in Darwinian evolutionary theory, we have something that can possibly be measured, tested, etc., okay? Because it has an empirical component. However, notice that he says no one experiment is going to be able to prove or disprove Darwinian evolutionary theory. Instead, it advances a framework or a lens through which we look at available data and evidence, and it seems to make the most sense, according to McGilchrist, of all of the data that I receive. Oh, this theory is very valuable when I go to do biology, when I go to do, meteorology, when I go to do geology, when I go to engage with, the fossil record, etc. He says this makes a lot of sense of many different data points. But even here, notice, it's not like you just have one piece of evidence to prove it or not prove it. Instead, a theory that's this big, you need to ask, how does it make sense of my whole world. Notice also, he made a differentiation between a theory like Freud's that is purely mental, non-falsifiable, right? You can still prove it or disprove it, and a theory like Darwin's. How often do we find people who are of a Darwinian evolutionary theory perspective try to attack Christianity, which in our illustration is very much like Freud's theory of it being purely in the mental sphere, that you can't demonstrate it or prove it with science? How often do we have scientific-minded people say, prove Christianity to me with science? Happens all the time. Give me proof. Give me evidence. And his point is that's not how these things are proven. It would be like going to Freud and saying, Freud, prove your theories with evidence. He doesn't have any, not of that type at least. This is not the only way in which things are proven. We have a presuppositional lens through which we look at the world, and we use it to interpret all of the data. The real question is, does the lens I'm currently wearing, is the worldview through which I'm looking at things actually making sense of the world out there? Does it make sense of my experience? That's the real question.
We therefore can, and if we are rational, must have an extremely high degree of confidence in the theory. Of course, I make no claim to be a Freud or a Darwin, but I do see clearly that my hypothesis is in this respect more like Darwin's than Freud's. It certainly can act as a philosophical model that reconfigures our knowledge in a way that I believe is richer.
So that would be a Freud-like approach. Oh, it gives me a richness to helping me understand all of the areas of available knowledge. But he's going to prove, well, there are certain experiments that I use to bolster my theory that is much more like Darwin, because I use experiments and evidence.
But it is derived from and can be tested against empirical, experimental observations. The hypothesis could be seen as an aggregate of more local hypotheses, each of which can be tested against empirical evidence, and which can each be abandoned if they do not stand up to the findings. Enough such negative findings would invalidate the overall hypothesis, at least in its current form. Alternatively, it might turn out that at least some observations, enormously varied in kind, are consistent with this theory.
And if you look at the history of evolution, this has happened, right? I don't know, when I was learning evolutionary theory, you had punctuated equilibrium and gradualism and different, because people were trying to adjust or adapt the theory to fit the evidence that they were finding. But this is how you try to do things. This is how you try to fit it in. And eventually, if it doesn't line up with enough of the evidence, you throw the theory out entirely. Obviously, this is a bad theory. It's not working. But this is how we do these things.
And many of them are consistent with no other theory that has been proposed. That is my belief. What might be examples of such observations in the case of theory explained in this book? Let's start from some really basic questions about the brain that, fundamental as they are, have not to my knowledge been satisfactorily addressed by any other theory. Why is the brain an organ that exists only to make connections divided? Why is it asymmetrical in so many measurable respects, both structural and functional, and why does its functioning seem to depend on its being asymmetrical? And why is the major connection between the two cerebral hemispheres, the corpus callosum, getting proportionately smaller and functionally more inhibitory, rather than larger and functionally more facilitatory, with evolution? These indisputable observations are not addressed as satisfactorily by any alternative theories of which I am aware. But far more important...
Now again, he's bringing up specifics about his theory, but we can apply the same type of thinking to the arguments surrounding creation, evolution, Christianity, naturalistic materialism, etc., right? So here is an observable thing, right? Human beings love one another, right? We love one another. And so how would you examine each worldview in light of this piece of evidence? Okay, does naturalistic materialism more account for human beings loving one another, or does Christianity more account for human beings loving one another? Well, you would have to answer questions like, what is love? What does it mean? Is it just neurons firing in the brain? Is that what we mean when we tell our spouse we love them? Do we mean spouse? The neurons are firing in my brain right now that make me feel a certain emotion towards you. That feels really cold. It doesn't feel like love. So you take a piece of evidence, human beings love one another, and you try to fit it within each worldview. Now, that may not be conclusive. You might not be able to go, well, clearly love is a Christian idea and it doesn't fit at all with naturalistic materialism. They might have an explanation of it from naturalistic materialism. Fine. But you do this piecemeal. Okay, human beings love one another. Okay, very good, right? Well, again, to flip the other side of the coin, it appears that human beings have evolved from ape-like ancestors. Okay, does naturalistic materialism line up more with that, or does Christianity? Well, then you got to bring Genesis into the question. And on you go. We're perceiving evidence. We're then trying to fit it within each respective worldview, and we're seeing if it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense within the worldview, we either adjust our worldview or we try to find some sort of hole in that evidence. And on it goes. If both sides would just understand this, we could have much better conversations.
Important than any of these, important as they nonetheless are, is that there is no alternative theory that makes sense as a whole of a large number of established hemisphere differences. We have no overarching theory that covers so many of the facts. They are otherwise simply treated as a random assortment of findings, inviting a shrug when the questions why such individual differences exist and how they make sense together are asked. But to me, for a scientist not to ask precisely these questions betrays an astonishing lack of intellectual curiosity, to say the least. The explanatory power of the hemisphere hypothesis is greater than any alternative I know of, and as for the difference deniers, they can't even get to first base.
Do you hear that? And essentially, that's the case we're trying to make with Christianity. The explanatory power of Christianity for the world in which I live is so great, and for the other worldviews, they can't even get to first base. That's essentially what we're saying. Now, and of course, somebody else who looks at the world differently is going to say the explanatory power of naturalistic materialism is so great, and other worldviews can't even get to first base. There you go. That's Jordan Peterson versus Sam Harris. Right there, right next to each other, right? Sam Harris thinks the explanatory power of naturalistic materialism is so great, Christianity can't even get to first base. Jordan Peterson believes the exact opposite, just flip it. But that's what we're doing when we're conversing with each other. That's what we're saying. This explanatory power of this worldview that I have is so great compared to all other worldviews.
When a better theory is developed that covers as many findings, I will be the first to welcome it. That is how understanding evolves.
There you go. And that's what we're supposed to be doing when we're conversing with each other on these topics. Okay? That is what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be going back and forth with all the information, and here's some evidence. Okay, does that fit within this worldview? Here's some other evidence. Does that fit within this worldview? And we're just trying to sort through all of the evidence, the material, the data we have. Okay? Now, I have one other point on this, and he brings this up in chapter 3. So I'm going to skip to chapter 3. Here's one of the problems, guys. And this needs to be said for all parties. Remember my illustration of dead men don't bleed, okay? Remember that. When you are looking at evidence, it's not always obvious what evidence you're going to fit into your worldview and what ones you're not. It's not always obvious what beliefs you're going to give up and not give up. To put it in a different way, the glasses through which you look at things color the way you look at things, okay? So it's almost a bit of a circular thing, right? So if you're a naturalistic materialist and you look at things through an empirical lens, you're likely to selection bias data through a particular lens. You see what I mean? And the same goes through Christianity. If you are looking at evidence through a Christian lens, you are likely to selection bias data that supports a Christian worldview. That's how this works. This is what happens in politics, okay? You have a right-wing politician really focusing on things they see wrong with left-wing politicians, and every time they say something that even halfway sounds bad, They'll bring it out because they're looking for it. Selection bias. But the same happens the other side, the other direction. And so all you have is both sides constantly pointing out the worst faults in the other, the worst examples in the other. I can't believe they said this. I can't believe they said that. And on and on and on it goes. There's a selection bias. So too for our worldview discussion. Christians are much more likely to identify certain evidences that prove Christianity. You have a selection bias. Atheists are much more likely to find evidence that proves atheism. Selection bias. This is really hard to overcome, guys. Once you understand that we're looking through different worldviews, then to add the idea on it that the lens or perspective through which you see it also affects what you're going to see, it makes it very, very difficult. At very least, we need to be aware of it. Okay, at very least, we need to be aware of it. This is just a couple minutes from McGilchrist here. Let's listen for a couple minutes where he talks about having different frameworks and how those affect what you're going to see. Okay?
There are aspects of quantum physics that would support such a view.
Right here.
This fact that knowledge comes from distinctions implies that we can come to an understanding of the nature of any one thing, whatever it might be, only by comparison with something else we already know.
Hear that. You can only come to an understanding of something only by comparing it to something you already know. You're utilizing existing categories, existing information from your already established worldview to interpret new data. This just happens. It is what it is.
And by observing the similarities and differences. However, just as everything changes its nature, however slightly, when it changes its context, what we choose to compare a thing with determines which aspects of it will stand forward and which will recede.
So when you have a worldview, it is certain aspects of evidence are going to be more obvious to you, and certain aspects of its evidence are going to be further away from you. You need to understand this. Your framework, your worldview, also affects how you perceive evidence. This is not a circle, it's a spiral. I'll show this in a second, but this is what he's pointing out.
Thus, comparing a football match with a trip to the betting shop brings out some aspects of the experience. Comparing it with going to church brings out others. The model we choose to use to understand something determines what we find.
Hear that. The model we choose to use to understand something determines what we find. They're inextricably linked together. You can't separate these two.
If it is the case that our understanding is an effect of the metaphors we choose, it is also true that it is a cause. Our understanding itself guides the choice of metaphor by which we understand it. The chosen metaphor is both cause and effect of the relationship. Thus, how we think about ourselves and our relationship to the world is already revealed in the metaphors we unconsciously choose to talk about it.
This contributes to positive feedback loops, like we've talked about before in other videos. The idea that you're using a certain lens to look at something informs what you see. You're looking at a picture, think of Where's Waldo, right? When you're looking at Where's Waldo picture, you know you're looking for a white and red striped shirt. If Waldo happened to not be wearing a white and red striped shirt, you would be unlikely to find him for some period of time. I don't know if you guys have ever done this experiment, but somebody will say, count the number of times each of the teammates pass the basketball back and forth between each other. 30-second clip. Okay, they're passing the basketball. Okay, and you're looking. Okay, 1 pass, 2 passes, 3 pass, 4 pass, 5 pass. And you're counting. How many passes? Then at the end, they say, okay, how many passes? And you're like, 22. I got it. I kept good track, 22. And they're like, who saw the gorilla walk through the frame? And everyone's like, what are you talking about? And they're like, yeah, a giant guy in a gorilla suit just walked right through the frame while the team was passing the ball between each other. And you're like, no way. No way. A gorilla didn't walk through the frame. And sure enough, you rewind it and play it back, and there's a gorilla walking right through the frame. Why? You were focused on the passing. The same goes for your worldview. Your worldview is coloring what you pick up on. The selection bias, okay? You can't help it. If you say, this is the metaphor, this is the lens through which I'm going to view the evidence, and then you look at the evidence, it's no wonder it is a positive feedback loop. Let's let him finish, and then I want to draw one quick diagram.
That choice further entrenches our partial view of the subject. Paradoxically, we seem to be obliged to understand something, including ourselves, well enough to choose the appropriate model before we can understand it. Our first leap determines where we land. If we assume a purely mechanical universe and take the machine as our model, we will uncover the view that, surprise, surprise, the body and the brain with it is a machine. To a man with a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. But because we can come to know things only in terms of other things we know, every explanation, however convincing, is merely a model, a comparison of something with something else.
There you go. Okay? Surprise, surprise, if we choose to look at the world through a mechanistic lens, it turns out we discover the world is mechanistic. You see the point? We feed into ourselves in this way. Now, here's the thing I want to show you guys. This is often described as a vicious circle, okay? That, essentially, if I can put it this way, let's see if I can get this to work. Oh, yeah, this is going to work, okay? If I can put it this way, guys, this is often described as a vicious circle. That and this is what postmodern thinkers have kind of concluded, okay? Postmodernists, this is why they say it's just truth for you and truth for me, okay? So your lens, we'll call it your worldview, dictates how you view the facts, and the facts you choose to focus on dictate how you do your worldview. It's a vicious circle, and postmodernists therefore conclude there's truth for you, truth for me, and that's it. That's it. Truth for you and truth for me. But this isn't how it works, okay? It's not a vicious circle. Why? Let me show you. This actually functions like a spiral, okay? This is how it actually functions if we will allow it to. Your facts determine your worldview, but then your worldview affects your facts. Now, if you're doing this correctly, you will do so critically enough to where you're a little bit narrower the next time. And then you can look at facts again, and now this will help you tighten down on your worldview. Okay? And if you're doing this correctly, then your worldview, if you're doing this correctly, then your worldview will help you to tighten down on the facts. Okay? This is the process we're engaged in. This is in some circles called the hermeneutical spiral. All right? It's very important, and it's how our search for knowledge actually works. Okay? So recognize that you're utilizing a spiral to narrow in on your ideas between worldview facts. The reason I went through all of this is this has been discussed a lot in apologetics circles, Christians engaging with atheists. But I noticed the same ideas when I listened to McGilchrist, and I saw how he was relating the ideas to one another. I was like, I feel like I'm listening to Bahnsen again. And of course, McGilchrist is coming at it from a completely different perspective. And I thought this could be so helpful to try and get people to understand presuppositions and how we relate to one another and how our ideas relate to themselves. I truly believe if everybody goes through the study, listens to what we had to say here, and considers it seriously, we can have better, more productive, and more meaningful conversations. Please do not think that in this video, I'm trying to assert you must be a presuppositionalist. All I'm saying is let's understand how worldviews and facts relate to one another, and let's help us to have a better conversation with each other, okay? That's the idea. This isn't a vicious circle, it's a spiral, and the more we're willing to listen to each other and go, okay, I can't fit that piece of evidence within my worldview. It's not making much sense. Help me to understand it from your perspective. The more we do that, the more progress we can make in these discussions and conversations. Hey guys, a great part of Christian growth and discipleship comes from engaging with one another and iron sharpening iron. If you would like to more actively engage with this community, we would love to have you. If you hit up Twitch or Discord down in the description below, you can get more involved in this conversation, and we would love to have you there. Also, if you would like to support this channel, please do so through Patreon. The link is down in the description below. Take care. God bless. Bye now.